Hello everyone, and welcome. I hope you're warm, comfortable, and not currently relying on a single stove, a thin blanket, and a very optimistic attitude to get through the night. Because on the American frontier in the 1800s, that was often considered perfectly adequate winter preparation. Before we step into snowstorms, buried shelters, and the kind of cold that made pioneers quietly question every decision that brought them west. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Night feels different depending on where you are, and these stories always seem to travel farthest after dark. And if you enjoy calm, long-form history meant to be listened to slowly rather than watched closely, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you might think. And unlike the people in tonight's story, you won't need a shovel to find us again. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. Tonight, we step into a winter that does not announce itself with drama, but with pressure, the kind that builds quietly until the land itself feels heavier, as if the sky has leaned too far downward and decided not to move again. And you are standing there on the open plains with nothing between you and the wind, but fabric, breath, and time. The snow has not yet fully arrived, but the air already tastes sharp and metallic, like frozen iron, and each breath feels borrowed rather than owned, as though the cold is keeping careful count of how much warmth you are allowed to keep. Somewhere behind you exists the idea of home, a cabin imagined but unfinished, walls planned but not yet raised, a future that assumed winter would wait politely, while ahead of you stretches a season that does not recognize plans at all. This is the quiet truth, often softened in later retellings. That winter on the early American frontier was not sudden or spectacular, but patient and accumulative, advancing inch by inch, convincing the land itself to stop cooperating. Pioneers wrote less about fear and more about endurance, because fear came quickly, but endurance was what decided who remained. You feel the storm before you see it. The wind drops lower, becomes steadier, carrying with it the faint hiss of snow sliding across frozen ground, a sound mentioned again and again in frontier letters as a warning many recognized too late. Weather records did not exist here, and clouds were read more by instinct than science, leaving settlers to guess whether the sky was passing through or settling in. Your boots crunch at first, then soften as snow deepens, and every step begins to cost more energy than the last. The land offers no shelter, no trees thick enough to break the wind, no ridges high enough to hide behind, only distance and exposure. The cold does not attack immediately. It waits, testing fingers, ears, and nose, seeing how long you plan to ignore it. Some pioneers believed they could outrun storms simply by moving forward, confidence shaped by older European experience where forests were closer and villages never far apart. Historians still debate whether that confidence was bravery or misunderstanding, but either way, movement becomes harder as visibility collapses, the horizon dissolving until up and down lose meaning, and the world narrows into a white, spinning uncertainty. You stop not because you choose to, but because your body insists. Sound changes first. Wind dulls, snow absorbs noise, and silence thickens until even your breathing feels too loud. This quiet is not peaceful, but padded and unsettling, like being underwater, and it is here that the idea of going underground begins to form, not as a plan, but as instinct. The earth beneath your feet does not move. It does not scream. It holds a steady, muted cold that feels almost kind compared to the slicing air above. You do not know yet that soil below the frost line maintains a more stable temperature. But when you kneel and press your glove to the ground, it does not bite back. Frontier journals mention a small but telling observation, that animal burrows often remained free of ice long after storms passed, and that rabbits and foxes seemed to understand something humans were still learning. Some settlers laughed at the idea of hiding like animals, others paid attention, and survival often belonged to the second group. The first shovel of earth is the hardest. Frozen soil resists like stone, metal ringing sharply in the quiet, your arms burning as sweat forms beneath layers that moments ago felt insufficient. The smell of damp dirt rises, oddly comforting, carrying with it the memory of warmer seasons you try not to think about. Snow piles faster than you can clear it, a reality often overlooked in frontier history, where snowfall could bury surface structures before they were finished. Underground, the snow begins to work for you instead, stacking above as insulation. You pause, breathing hard, and already the wind feels farther away. The hole is small and unimpressive, but it offers something priceless: separation. Historians still debate whether these early underground shelters were desperate improvisations or intentional adaptations, but the truth likely lies between panic and insight. You lower yourself into the shallow pit, curling instinctively to preserve heat, the ground pressing firm and cold against your back, steady rather than cruel. The soundscape shifts again. Wind becomes distant. Snowfall turns into a soft whisper overhead, and your heartbeat grows louder, slow and heavy. There is fear here, but it is quieter than the fear above ground, a contained fear with edges you can understand. You pack earth loosely to block drafts, leaving just enough space for air, knowing without fully knowing that ventilation is a gamble pioneers often misunderstood. As minutes pass, your breathing steadies, the ground smelling rich beneath the frost, reminding you that life continues below even when the surface appears dead. This choice to trust the earth is not heroic and not hopeful, but practical and quiet, and it is the reason you are still breathing as the storm settles in above you hour after hour without any intention of stopping. You wake without realizing you ever slept. Time has lost its edges, worn smooth by the dark and the stillness. You do not know if it has been an hour or a day, only that the air inside your small hollow feels thicker, more familiar, as if your body has slowly adjusted to the narrow rhythm of survival. Above you, the storm continues, not in great bursts of thunder or howling wind, but in the soft, constant pressure of snow, accumulating, layer upon layer, like the world quietly choosing to forget what lies beneath it. The weight presses down through the soil in gentle pulses. You can almost feel it in your chest, a heartbeat that belongs to the land rather than to you. Historians later described these storms as white graves, because fences disappeared, wagons vanished, even cabins seemed to sink into the ground. Letters recovered from the Great Plains tell of families trapped for days, sometimes weeks, in snowdrifts higher than their roofs, surviving on melted ice and the smallest fragments of hope. You move carefully now. Every motion feels expensive. Warmth has become a form of currency, and you spend it slowly. In the dim air, you chew a piece of dried meat so tough it barely yields. It's not food anymore, just a way to keep the body reminded of purpose. Frontier diaries often mention how cold dulls hunger, how the body, in protecting itself, stops demanding what it can no longer have. You don't feel starvation yet, only distance, as if your stomach belongs to someone else. In the earth around you, small sounds continue. A drip, a crack, the deep whisper of frozen ground settling. For a moment you think you hear breathing, but it's only wind threading through the narrow air channels you left above you. You remember the trick you read about, using hollowed gourds or reeds for ventilation, and you adjust your sleeve to test the draft. Air still moves. That's enough. There is an old phrase found in a Nebraska farmer Sips letter from 1873. The earth is cold, but it does not hate you. It sounds strange now, but you understand what he meant. Up there the cold hunts. Down here it waits. There is a difference. You close your eyes and let the stillness wrap around you. You think of the cabin you never finished, the window frame leaning against the wall, the tools frozen solid on the ground outside. Somewhere, maybe miles away, your neighbors are doing the same thing, digging in, pressing close to the soil, waiting for the storm to remember mercy. This was how the first sod houses were born, not from blueprints or plans, but from necessity, from the memory of what it felt like to survive once by trusting the earth. Later, these shelters would be refined, half dugouts and full earth homes built right into riverbanks, lined with straw, logs, or even buffalo hides for insulation. But their origin was not design. It was instinct. The first people who lived through storms like this remembered. and they built differently the next time. As the hours stretch into a blur, something strange happens. The dark no longer feels threatening. It begins to cradle you. The human mind, when pressed to its limits, sometimes finds safety in surrender. You think about how the land above is shifting, reshaping itself without witnesses, and you realize you've joined the rhythm of it, the slow patience of things buried. Every now and then you catch a faint vibration, perhaps from a distant horse or wagon wheel, or maybe just the sigh of the wind tracing the contours of the plains. There is comfort in not knowing. Down here, sound becomes imagination, and imagination becomes warmth. In later decades, survivors would tell their children stories of that kind of quiet, how the world felt smaller but somehow more honest underground. One woman in her diary called it sleeping inside the season itself. Another wrote that the snow sounded like breath, as if the storm were alive and for the first time tired. You begin to understand what they meant. The line between the living and the waiting blurs. Every sound above you feels distant, softened by layers of snow and soil. Time has stopped measuring itself in minutes. It counts only heartbeats. Outside, the storm will last 3 days. Some will not wake when it ends, but you do not know that yet. You are listening to the silence, and for now, silence feels like safety. The earth holds you the way the sea holds a drifting boat, steady, indifferent, and endlessly patient. And while the snow keeps falling above, you finally close your eyes, not in despair but in understanding. You are no longer fighting the storm. You are learning to wait with it. When you finally wake again, it's not the light that finds you first, but the weight. The storm has passed, but the air above still presses downward as though reluctant to let go. For a few long moments you don't move at all. You listen. The sound that once roared through the plains has vanished, replaced by something stranger, the stillness that comes only after survival. You push upward carefully, the frozen soil flaking away like bark. At first it resists, and for one terrible second you think the world has sealed you in for good. Then, with a soft crumble, daylight spills through the narrow gap. It's not bright daylight. Pale, muted, filtered through clouds so dense they seem carved from stone. But it feels like a miracle all the same. You pull yourself upward until your hands find the surface. The snow is deep, heavier than you imagined. Every movement is slow, deliberate, ritualistic. When your head finally breaks through, the cold air rushes over your face like baptism, sharp, stinging, but alive. This is the aftermath. No painting ever captures the land flattened, transformed into a featureless white ocean. The fences are gone, the wagon ruts erased, the cabins swallowed up to their roofs. Somewhere nearby, a shape breaks the monotony. Perhaps a drifted chimney, perhaps the top of a tree bent under the weight of ice. The world looks both new and ancient, like creation and extinction happening at the same time. In letters recovered from Kansas and Nebraska homesteads, settlers often describe this moment with reverence rather than relief. One woman wrote, "It was so still that even the heart seemed afraid to continue." Another said the snow glittered like ground glass, beautiful and cruel in equal measure. These were not exaggerations. They were attempts to make sense of a silence so vast it could swallow thought itself. You crawl out of the pit, your limbs slow and stiff. Each breath is visible, rising in faint silver clouds that drift away without sound. For the first time in days, the wind has stopped completely, as if exhausted by its own violence. The land does not feel dead. It feels paused. You turn, looking for any sign of the small world you once knew, the outline of the cabin, the faint trail of footsteps, the corral where horses once stood restless in the night. Everything has been buried under one continuous glittering surface. The horizon is smooth, seamless, like the lid of a closed world. There are no landmarks now, only instinct. Pioneers often relied on fence lines or creek beds to find their way home after storms, but both are gone. The only direction that exists is the one your body remembers. You start walking. Each step sinks deep, the snow creaking under your weight. Your legs tremble, not from fear, but from the strange disbelief of still being alive. In the distance, you spot a small rise in the land, perhaps where the sod roof of a neighbor's dugout once stood. Many of these early shelters saved lives that winter. When the Great Plains storms became relentless, settlers began building what they called half-holes, part dwelling, part burrow, cut directly into slopes and riverbanks. The walls were thick with clay, lined with grass or animal hide, the roofs low but strong. They were dark, cramped, and often damp, yet they gave what cabins could not: endurance. A journalist from Missouri visiting frontier towns in the 1870s described these dwellings as graves with chimneys, but he missed the point. They were not symbols of defeat. They were the earth lending its strength to those who listened. As you walk across the frozen plain, you think about this. The wind has stripped away the pride of building upward, leaving behind only what was built downward, close to the ground, patient as the soil itself. Somewhere ahead, a faint movement catches your eye. A figure wrapped in furs emerges from another drift, blinking at the light just as you did. You wave weakly at first, then stronger, and the figure waves back. That's all it takes. For the first time in days, the frontier is no longer silent. Historians rarely write about this kind of moment, but it exists in letters, in the trembling handwriting of people who had no words for what they felt, the shared relief of recognizing another heartbeat on the horizon. Together you dig out the small things that prove the world continues. A frozen bucket, a broken sled, the corner of a window frame. Somewhere below, the remains of a fire still wait, buried but not extinguished. When flame finally catches, it's small, stubborn, orange against all that white. The smoke rises straight upward into the pale sky, and for a fleeting second it looks like the land itself exhaling. In that fragile warmth, the truth of the frontier becomes clear. Survival here was never about strength or conquest. It was about surrendering, about listening to the land instead of commanding it, about trusting the quiet more than the noise. You sit by the fire as the snow softens and the horizon slowly returns, and for the first time you understand why the pioneers never told stories about glory, only about endurance. When spring finally comes, it doesn't announce itself with color or sound. It begins quietly, in the smallest possible ways: the dripping of ice from the roof of a half-buried home, the soft cracking of soil that has been sealed for months, the faint scent of water finding its way through frozen earth. You would almost miss it if you didn't know what to listen for. The snow doesn't melt all at once. It recedes in slow breaths, each day pulling back another inch, revealing what the storm tried to erase. The world reappears unevenly, patches of brown grass, the curve of a fence post, the black ribs of a wagon wheel that someone will never claim again. The land exhales and the silence lifts. When you step outside your dugout now, the air feels different. Not warm exactly, but forgiving. The wind no longer carries the knife's edge of winter. It carries memory instead, a soft, distant echo of what you've endured. The sun, pale and uncertain, feels almost shy as it touches your skin. Historians often describe these months as the rebirth of the frontier, but rebirth was not a single event. It was a process, muddy, uneven, full of mistakes and small victories. Families emerged from the ground, blinking like moles, their faces lean, their clothes faded to the color of the earth itself. Children, silent all winter, began to speak again. And when the first birds returned weak, exhausted but alive, many settlers wrote that it felt like hearing God breathe. In a letter from Dakota Territory, a woman named Eliza Porter wrote, "We stepped out and did not recognize our own fields. The land looked new, as if someone else had dreamed it while we were sleeping." That line appears in several history books now, often quoted for its poetry, but it wasn't written to be poetic. It was written by someone who had buried her home beneath snow and dug it out again, by hands cracked and bleeding from cold, by someone who understood what it meant to be humbled and grateful at the same time. The months that follow are a kind of slow rebuilding. The settlers dry their blankets in the sun, patch the walls of their sod houses, and repair fences half swallowed by the thaw. They count what survived: a barrel of grain, a few tools, perhaps a cow or two. They plant again, not because they expect abundance, but because life demands repetition. The act itself becomes a prayer. Somewhere on the plains, a preacher traveling between homesteads delivers his first sermon of spring. He speaks not of heaven or damnation, but of endurance, of patience, of how even the earth must rest before it can grow. People listen not out of duty, but because the words sound true now in a way they never did before the storm. The landscape begins to change. Streams reappear, muddy and overflowing. The scent of wet hay drifts through the air. Tools ring against wood and stone, the rhythm of rebuilding filling the silence winter left behind. In the evenings, when the sky turns a bruised shade of violet, families gather around fires again, this time above ground. They tell stories, not of heroism, but of the small, stubborn choices that kept them alive. They laugh about the absurdity of it, how they slept beside the roots, how a rabbit hole inspired a home, how they learned to breathe like the earth. And when they look up at the stars, they see them differently now, not as distant decorations, but as steady lights that waited through the darkness. Some pioneers will stay here, turning this memory into foundation. Others will leave, moving westward again, chasing the next open horizon. But wherever they go, they will carry the same lesson buried in their bones, that survival is not loud, that courage is not always visible, and that sometimes the only way to endure the storm is to listen to the ground beneath your feet and let it hold you until the sky remembers mercy. In time, towns will rise where dugouts once stood. Railroads will cross these plains. Children born years from now will walk the same land and never know what it cost to live here, to endure the soundless winters, to hide beneath the earth while the world above went white. But somewhere in the soil, beneath the fields, beneath the fences and roads, the memory remains. The old shelters collapse slowly, filled with rain and grass, until they are indistinguishable from the rest of the prairie. Yet when the wind shifts and the ground trembles with thaw, it is said you can still hear it, a faint, low hum like breathing. The sound of the earth remembering that once, for a little while, humans learned to live as gently as it does. By the next winter, the memory of the storm still lingers. It lives not in stories told aloud, but in the quiet habits of those who survived. You see it in the way they check the horizon before sundown, or how they measure the wind not by strength but by tone. Some can tell by sound alone when snow is coming, how the grass whispers differently, how the breath of the animals deepens, how the land seems to inhale before it disappears again under white. The dugouts are no longer temporary. They become homes. Over time, they take on the smell of smoke and clay, of stew simmering too long, of human life pressed close against the patience of the earth. These places are dark, yes, but warm in ways that wood and brick never were. Children are born underground now, swaddled in blankets near fires that never go out, their first lullaby the soft hum of wind above soil. It's strange to imagine that for many settlers this wasn't despair, it was design. As years passed, the sod house became a symbol of endurance, almost a philosophy. The ground holds heat. One man wrote in 1879, and it does not care what the sky decides. Farmers began cutting their homes directly into the land, choosing hillsides and ravines not for beauty, but for shelter. They built front doors of rough-hewn boards, small square windows for air, and let the back walls remain solid earth. In summer, they stayed cool. In winter, they barely froze. No wind could touch what lived beneath it. Visitors from the east, unused to such pragmatism, often mocked these homes. Newspapers called them prairie rat holes. Some travelers refused to stay the night in them, believing they would suffocate underground. But those who lived here knew better. They understood that comfort wasn't the goal. Continuance was. Historians later traced the idea back further than anyone expected, to the traditions of native tribes who had long built semi-subterranean lodges from sod and willow. The Mandaean and Arikara peoples of the northern plains had known for centuries what the newcomers had to learn the hard way, that survival in a land of extremes required humility, not conquest. In a way, the settlers had finally started listening, not to textbooks but to the land itself. The old arrogance, the belief that the frontier could be tamed, gave way to something quieter. You see it in the way they walk now, slower, more deliberate, aware that the wind is not an enemy but a teacher. When blizzards return, the new generation of settlers doesn't panic. They dig in before the first real snow arrives. They stack food, water, lamp oil. They bank their roofs with hay and soil, turning the ground itself into a shield. The storm still comes, as it always will, but this time the people are ready. Inside the dugouts, time becomes elastic again. The days blur into one another. But now there's rhythm, chopping, cooking, mending, tending to the livestock that huddle nearby in pits or barns half dug into the earth. The sound of human life blends with the muted heartbeat of the soil. The children play by candlelight, drawing with charcoal on walls that used to be roots. Someone reads from a worn Bible. Someone else hums a hymn too softly to follow. You can almost feel the warmth of those rooms, thick and uneven but real. A warmth earned through knowledge rather than luck. And when the snow begins to fall heavier, they no longer measure it with fear. They listen for the sound of it piling on the roof, dull and steady, like the padding of a blanket. They know it means insulation, protection, safety. In one journal from 1881, a settler woman wrote simply, "The snow is our roof now. The house is asleep, and so are we." It's one of the most beautiful lines left behind from that century, not because of its poetry, but because of its peace. These were people who had stopped fighting the world and started moving with it. Out on the plains, not all survived. Many still perished, caught between distance and frost. But even in loss, a kind of wisdom took root. Towns grew slowly from the edges of these dugout communities, not in defiance of nature, but as extensions of it. The first stores were built low and narrow, their walls insulated with straw and clay. Churches were carved partly into hillsides, their bells muffled in winter, but still ringing faintly across the snow. A frontier priest named Father McAllister once wrote, "We build half under the earth because heaven feels too far above us, but even down here, prayer still finds its way upward." That sentence lingers. It captures something deeper about the human instinct that built the West, not arrogance or expansion, but the fragile, stubborn refusal to vanish. Outside, as the decades move forward, the railroads begin to carve their paths across the frozen fields. Telegraph poles appear, their wires singing softly in the wind. Civilization is arriving, but beneath its surface, the memory of that first buried winter remains. Even as towns expand and the sod houses fade back into the earth, the wisdom they held never disappears completely. Generations later, when architects study natural insulation or engineers design storm shelters, they unknowingly repeat what those early pioneers learned with shovels and desperation, that sometimes the most human thing you can do is to move closer to the ground. You can almost imagine one of them now, a farmer in the 1880s, standing at dusk beside the small mound that hides his home. The air is bitter, but calm. The prairie stretches silent in every direction. He looks toward the horizon, the same endless sweep that took so many before him, and instead of fear, he feels gratitude, because he knows that beneath his feet, under the snow and the frost, warmth still waits. Not comfort, not abundance, just enough. And on the frontier, enough was everything. As the years pass, the dugouts no longer feel like wounds in the land. They begin to resemble something else entirely, small earthen hearts beating beneath the prairie. Every winter, smoke rises from invisible chimneys, curling upward through the snow like thin grey ribbons, proof that life continues even when the world above seems frozen still. Inside, everything has a rhythm. The same rhythm you hear in the slow breathing of the wind, in the creak of a wooden chair, in the steady tick of water dripping into a pan. The pioneers who once feared the ground now treat it as kin. They lean their backs against the packed walls and feel the faint pulse of the soil, the vibration of faraway hoofbeats, the gentle sigh of shifting frost. Children learn to tell time not by clocks but by sound. The muffled scrape of snow sliding down the roof, the dull thud of a shovel clearing a path to daylight. They learn to find warmth in small things, a tin mug heated by the fire, a slice of bread held over coals until the edges blacken, the quiet laughter of a parent retelling the same story just to keep their voices alive. Superstitions grow here too, half folklore, half memory. Some families believe that the storm can hear you if you speak too loudly, so they whisper for weeks at a time, their words soft as the breath of sleeping animals. Others leave a bit of grain or dried meat near the door before the first snowfall, an offering for the wind itself, as if to say, "We acknowledge you, please pass over gently this year." And in those nights, long and unbroken, when the candles run low and the walls seem to hum, people tell stories, not stories of heroism or conquest, but of endurance, of strange kindnesses found in impossible places. One tale often told across the plains speaks of a farmer's wife who lost her way in a blizzard, only to be led home by the sound of her cow lowing inside a half-buried barn. Another tells of a traveller who survived 3 days inside a hollow haystack, guided only by the glow of the northern lights shimmering faintly through the snow. No one knows if these stories are true anymore, but truth isn't what keeps them alive. It's comfort. It's rhythm. It's the need to hear another voice when the world outside has none. Even the tools have taken on personalities. The shovel leaned against the wall is called the companion. The oil lamp that burns through the night is the guardian. Small rituals emerge: touch the lamp 3 times before bed, knock once on the wall when you wake, feed the fire before speaking to anyone else. These habits, though born of fear, slowly become faith. And above them all, the land waits. Seasons change, snow thickens and retreats. Grass returns, burns, grows again. From a distance, no one would guess that people are living below, that beneath those smooth, rolling plains lies an entire world of hidden rooms, low ceilings and patient light. When travelers pass through in summer, they see only the faint outlines of the dugouts, small, dark openings in the hillsides, covered in wildflowers. But at night, if you stand still long enough, you can hear voices, laughter, maybe a lullaby carried faintly on the wind. The frontier becomes quieter with each passing decade. The railroad tracks hum in the distance, telegrams click through unseen wires, and the world begins to move faster. But out here, under the ground, time keeps its own slow measure. The pioneers may never call it that, but they have invented something close to peace, a peace born not from comfort but from understanding. Because the truth that took years to learn is simple: the earth does not take sides. It remembers. It absorbs. It forgives. In one forgotten diary found near the Platte River, a settler wrote, "We feared the land would bury us. Instead, it taught us how to rest." That single sentence says more about the frontier than 1,000 histories. And so, each winter when the first flakes begin to fall, these families prepare not with dread, but with ceremony. The candles are trimmed, the food is stored, the earth is brushed clean, the way one might tidy a guest room before an old friend arrives. Because out here, the storm is not a stranger anymore. It's part of the family. The night before the first blizzard, someone always says the same quiet phrase, passed down through generations: "We go below and the world goes on above." And just like that, the doors close, the fires glow, and another winter begins, its slow conversation with the human heart. After a few winters underground, the human mind begins to change. It learns the language of stillness. It starts to measure days not by the movement of the sun because you no longer see it, but by the soft pattern of routines, by the breathing of the people beside you, by the sigh of the wind when it remembers to visit. Inside these small rooms, time feels circular. You wake, you stoke the fire, you listen, you wait. There is a peace in repetition, but also a slow unraveling that no one speaks of. In the silence between chores, thoughts stretch and wander like roots through the soil. You begin to think differently, not of weeks or seasons, but of endurance itself, of what it means to remain while everything else disappears. Sometimes, in the middle of a long night, someone wakes and swears they can hear the world moving above them. The faint groan of the ice shifting on the river, the muted hooves of a deer crossing frozen ground, or the low hum of the wind sliding over the plains. It's a strange comfort to know that life still continues somewhere beyond reach. Dreams take on a different weight here. They feel slower, thicker, as if the mind itself has sunk beneath the earth. Pioneers write of dreaming in shades of brown and grey, of hearing voices call their names from deep within the soil. A few believe the land remembers every person who has ever slept inside it, that each winter adds another layer of memory, pressed quietly between frost and clay. There are moments when someone forgets what the sky looks like. A child once asked her mother, "What colour is it now?" The mother paused before answering because she could not remember either. So she said, softly, "It sets whatever colour you hope it is." That kind of imagination becomes survival. The stories told inside these rooms take on their own strange beauty. They are not about kings or wars, but about ordinary endurance, how a family survived on pickled beans for a month, how a cow found its way home after a storm, how a stranger knocked on the door one night and never left. They whisper these things not to entertain, but to remind themselves that the world beyond the walls still exists. And yet, beneath all that quiet, there's a kind of reverence growing, something deeper than fear or faith. When the fire burns low and the air inside the room feels heavy and sweet, a strange thought crosses the mind. Perhaps the land is not something to fight at all. Perhaps the cold is not punishment, but invitation. Historians who study these letters and diaries often notice a shift in language over time. The early entries speak of surviving the storm. The later ones speak of being kept by it. That difference is everything, because in the stillness of those winters, the pioneers begin to feel part of something much older. They no longer see themselves as intruders, but as guests in a place that tolerates them for a little while. And in that realization they find a peace they could not have imagined back east, surrounded by fences and clocks and crowded voices. One woman wrote, "There are nights when I cannot tell if the wind outside is alive or if we are the ones dreaming it." That line stayed in my mind for a long time, because it carries the entire truth of the frontier, that existence itself became porous, like frost melting on a window where the human and the natural world quietly traded places. By late February, when the storms begin to loosen their hold, the air changes again. It smells faintly of water. The walls, damp and dark all winter, begin to sweat. Somewhere outside, a single bird calls, a fragile thread of sound that feels almost impossible after months of silence. The people inside stop what they set to doing. No one speaks, they just listen, because in that one sound is the promise that the world still remembers them. When the thaw finally comes, it does not arrive like salvation. It seeps, it leaks through the cracks of the ceiling, slides down the walls in cold threads, pools in small puddles at your feet. The earth begins to exhale again, heavy and wet, as if it too has been holding its breath for too long. People emerge slowly, not triumphant, not eager, careful. The door, swollen with moisture, groans as it opens. Outside, the snow has broken apart into grey slabs, each one collapsing in on itself, melting into mud that clings to everything. The world is no longer white. It's brown and gold and soft, like bread rising after too long in the oven. You can smell life again. The soil, rank and sweet, smoke from a fire rekindled in daylight, the faint musk of thawed wood. These scents fill the lungs like medicine. After so many months of filtered air, breathing feels like an act of worship. Across the plains, the dugouts open one by one, fires are moved outside. Tools are carried into the light. People blink like moles, their eyes not used to brightness anymore. For a few minutes they stand still, just letting the wind touch their faces. Even the smallest breeze feels like luxury. Letters from this time describe how strange the world looked after the thaw, the way the horizon had shifted, the way fences seemed smaller, the way the land felt both familiar and new. One homesteader wrote, "It was as if God had swept his hand across the plains and rearranged everything we thought we knew. Fields that once seemed endless are now streaked with rivulets of meltwater glinting in the sun. Tools long buried in snow reappear like relics. The roofs of half-collapsed barns poke through the mud, tilted and defiant. The land is full of ghosts, silent reminders of what the storm claimed and what it left behind. Rebuilding begins the same day. There is no ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet scrape of shovels, the knock of hammers, the murmur of voices, planning and counting and measuring. They clear paths to the wells, repair doors, dig new trenches to drain the melt. And in the midst of all this, laughter returns, small at first, uncertain but real. Children run barefoot through mud so deep it swallows their ankles, chasing chickens that survived the winter by some small miracle. A man sings while mending a wagon wheel, the tune wobbly but confident. A woman hangs quilts on a line, their colours catching what little sunlight the sky allows. Life resumes not because it's easy, but because it must. Every year after this one feels a little less impossible. The storms still come, but they know what to do now. They prepare early, store more, dig deeper. They teach newcomers what they've learned, the tricks, the habits, the superstitions that once saved them. The knowledge spreads, not through books, but through stories told beside fires. Don't set build too high, they say. The sky doesn't set like pride. Always listen before you open the door. The wind will tell you if it sets safe. Never curse the cold. It sets the one thing that will never lie to you. Over time, these sayings become almost sacred. They form the unspoken religion of the plains, a faith in patience, in the slow rhythm of nature, in the idea that survival is not conquest, but conversation. By summer, the land has forgiven itself. Wildflowers bloom over the old dugouts, their roots drinking from melted snow. Rivers fill again, swollen and gold in the late light. The same children who once played in mud now help plant the first rows of corn. And when the nights turn cool again, their parents tell them stories of the winter below, of how silence became their friend, and how the ground itself learned their names. The storm is no longer something to fear. It is something to remember. A teacher, not a curse. And every spring, when the wind softens and the smell of wet soil returns, those who survived feel a strange tenderness for the world that nearly buried them. Because deep down they understand something that can sit to be written, only lived. That life on this frontier was never about building monuments to resist the wind. It was about learning how to breathe beneath it. The winters that followed were never quiet for long. By the time the first generation of settlers had built their sod homes and learned to survive beneath the snow, a different kind of storm was gathering. One made not of wind and ice, but of words and fire. The nation above them, stretched and divided, had begun to tear itself apart. When the Civil War reached its height, even the farthest frontiers felt its echo. Letters stopped coming. Prices rose. Young men who once mended fences or chopped wood disappeared eastward with rifles over their shoulders, leaving behind families who stared at the empty chairs beside their fires. Winter, which had once been only a season, became a mirror for everything the country was suffering. The cold didn't care which side you were on, Union or Confederate, free soil or slaveholding. It fell evenly on all. That Christmas, in 1863, snow blanketed both armies from Virginia to Tennessee. In Union camps, soldiers huddled around weak fires, their boots stiff with ice, their breath clouding the air in faint grey puffs. Some carved small wooden toys to send home, tiny horses, whistles and dolls made from scraps of uniform cloth. Others wrote letters by candlelight, their ink freezing between words. In one camp near Fredericksburg, a young soldier named Thomas Wainwright wrote to his wife, "It is snowing still, and the flakes find their way into our tents like they wish to join us. There is no singing tonight, only the wind. But I tell myself the same wind must be touching you too, and in that thought, I am warm. On the Confederate side, it was no different. Men burned fence posts and wagon wheels to keep warm, their breath thick in the night. One captain wrote that the snow in Virginia seemed to silence even the cannons. For a few strange days around Christmas, the war paused, not by treaty but by exhaustion. Soldiers from both sides could hear each other across the frozen rivers. Someone would hum a hymn, usually Silent Night, and the melody would drift through the trees until both camps were singing the same tune, unaware or uncaring of where one side ended and the other began. Historians often overlook these moments because they don't fit easily into stories of glory or defeat, but they are the truest parts of that winter. Thousands of men, half-starved and bone-cold, singing quietly into the same indifferent sky. Back on the frontier, where news arrived weeks late, the families who had once hidden beneath the earth felt the war like a distant vibration. The letters that did make it west were passed from cabin to cabin, read aloud by firelight, the names of places, Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, falling heavy and unfamiliar in rooms too small to contain them. Women hung simple wreaths of dried sage or prairie grass for Christmas, and prayed not for victory but for survival. They baked what they could, a bit of cornmeal, a handful of berries thawed over the fire, and told their children that every candle they lit was a light for someone far away trying to find their way home. In those years, Christmas became something quieter, something that lived in memory more than celebration. There were no trees to decorate, no music in the streets, no gatherings large enough to call a feast. Yet in that silence, faith changed shape. It became smaller, more personal, something carried inside rather than spoken aloud. A diary from 1864, written by a widow in Nebraska, reads, "The war has taken too many, but the earth keeps giving back. We dig deeper now, and the roots are warm. When I light my candle tonight, I will not ask for peace. I will ask only that the snow stays soft." There is something holy in that sentence, something that binds every kind of suffering into one quiet truth, that even when nations fight and the sky burns, the ground still waits, patient and unchanged, willing to shelter whoever remembers how to listen. By the end of the war, when the men who survived finally came home, they brought the silence of those winters with them. Some returned to cities and noise, others went west again to start over, to rebuild where the horizon was still empty enough to forgive. And among them were soldiers who had once crouched in frozen trenches, who now dug with the same hands to build homes underground, away from the sound of guns. The habit of survival had followed them. The stillness of winter had taught them something that no victory ever could, that true safety is never found in walls or weapons, but in the quiet bond between human breath and patient earth. And so the cycle began again. Every year, when the first snow fell, they lit small fires and remembered not just the wars of men, but the wars of weather, of hunger, of silence. They told their children that the land had already seen everything once, and that nothing was ever truly new, only returned. That Christmas, when the war finally ended, families gathered again in rooms small enough to feel human. There was bread on the table, smoke curling from chimneys, the faint glow of oil lamps flickering against walls made of clay. Outside, snow fell over graves and fields alike, covering them evenly, gently, as if to say, "Rest now. The earth remembers you all the same." The war ended, but the silence it left behind did not. For a long time the country spoke in half-whispers. Letters returned unread, flags folded in drawers, families counting names that never came back. And out on the frontier, where the earth still smelled of clay and smoke, people continued to build downward. It had become instinct now, a memory of safety carved into their bones. In the years after 1865, as trains began to stretch westward like veins of steel and telegraph wires started humming above the plains, the quiet world beneath the ground seemed to belong to another era. But for those who had lived there, who had hidden from storms both human and natural, it was impossible to forget what the earth had offered them. They watched as towns rose quickly, Wooden walls, painted signs, saloons full of laughter and impatience. The noise was constant, the movement endless. The country was moving on, rebuilding, believing that motion itself was a kind of healing. But there were still nights, especially in winter, when the wind returned with its long, low voice, and the old habits stirred again. Men would pause mid-step, listening. Women would glance at the door and wonder if they should have dug deeper, built thicker, kept closer to the ground. In the first Christmas after the war, 1865, newspapers in the East called it the Season of Light. They printed stories of reunion, of soldiers coming home, of cities decorating streets with pine and ribbon and hope. But in the West, light meant something different. It meant the oil lamp flickering in a dugout, the glow of coals being stirred after another long day. Out here, the holiday was quieter, less celebration, more reflection. Families sang the same hymns they had sung before, though their voices were softer now, thinned by memory. Children asked about fathers they would never meet, and mothers answered not with tears, but with the slow steadiness of those who had already learned how to live with loss. In the corner, on a small wooden shelf, someone had placed an old war medal beside a candle. It caught the light every time the fire cracked, flashing once, then disappearing again into the shadows. Historians later wrote that the post-war frontier was a time of progress, railroads, expansion, new towns, new wealth. But progress is never just forward motion. It is also forgetting. And those who had lived through the buried winters, through the storm and the silence, carried something the rest of the country did not. The understanding that survival was not triumph, and that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from standing still. When they gathered for Christmas in those years, they didn't speak much about the war. They spoke about weather, about crops, about the sky, ordinary things that felt safe. But under those simple words lay an unspoken knowing that the earth had kept them alive when men's politics had tried to destroy them. Old soldiers, now farmers, often knelt to feel the soil with the same care they once reserved for prayer. They said it helped them remember where they truly belonged. And when the snow returned as it always did, they no longer feared it. They saw it as a blanket, a kind of mercy, a reminder that the land forgives more quickly than people do. On one December night in 1867, a preacher on the frontier gave a Christmas sermon in a half-finished church, carved partly into a hillside. His congregation was small, families wrapped in furs, faces red from the cold, hands clasped in quiet anticipation. He looked around at the flickering lamps and said softly, "We sep learn to build from the ground up, not the sky down. Maybe that sep's what faith is." Outside, the wind rattled the boards. Inside, someone began to hum an old hymn. The children, sleepy and warm, leaned against their mother's sides, and for a moment the room felt eternal, like time itself had stopped to listen. As the years passed, the frontier slowly filled with fences, railroads, and noise. The dugouts collapsed one by one, their roofs sinking gently until they became part of the hills again. The prairie swallowed them without malice, as if taking back something it had loaned. But those who once lived there carried the memory wherever they went, that when the storms came and the world above froze, the ground had opened itself and said, "Come in, rest here, I'll keep you." And even decades later, when their grandchildren built tall houses with chimneys and glass, they still felt uneasy on the first snow. Somewhere deep in the body, the instinct remained to go lower, to listen, to wait, because the truth of that time was never about victory or discovery. It was about humility, about learning that the strongest people are not the ones who stand tall against the storm, but the ones who know when to bend, when to dig, when to disappear for a while until the sky changes its mind. And so, even in peace, the winter stories continued. Around Christmas, when the lamps burned late and the wind whispered through cracks in the walls, someone would always begin, "There was a time when we lived beneath the snow." The room would go quiet, and for a little while the world above would fade away again, and everyone would remember what it meant to be kept alive by the earth itself. By the 1880s, the frontier had changed its shape. Where there had once been open land and the sound of wind, There were fences now, miles of them, stretching in straight, obedient lines across the prairie. The railroad had arrived, a black vein of iron and smoke that cut the horizon clean in two. The world that once whispered now roared. For the children who had been born in dugouts, this new noise felt strange, almost unnatural. They had grown up with the heartbeat of the earth in their ears, with winters measured by breath and snowfall, not by timetables and train whistles. Now they watched their parents age quietly on porches, faces turned toward towns that glowed brighter each year, and felt less and less like home. Cities were rising, Chicago, St. Louis, Denver, each one a patch of light spreading into the darkness. There were jobs now, and money, and crowds, but there was also a kind of emptiness that no one could name. The land no longer spoke because no one was listening. At Christmas, the newspapers printed stories of progress, electric decorations, grand hotels, carols sung in opera houses. But on the edges of those same cities, in the smaller homes built by people who had once dug into the soil for warmth, the holiday remained a quieter thing. Old men would still pause before supper and say, "Do you hear that?" And everyone would listen, expecting the distant hum of a train, only to realize it was the wind still there, unchanged, pressing softly at the window panes like an old friend. In some places, those first earth homes were still standing, their roofs sagged under grass and time, their walls crumbling into the very fields they had once resisted. Children would stumble upon them while playing, unaware of what they were, thinking them the dens of animals. And perhaps they were, in a way, creatures built them, lived in them, survived in them. Humans were only one of the kinds that learned how. A farmer sip's journal from Kansas, written in 1889, captures the change in a single entry. We have good roofs now, lamps that stay lit, stoves that never go out. And yet sometimes when the snow falls heavy, I think of the dark under the ground and the peace that was there. The world above feels louder, but not warmer. That line lingers, like a draft through an old doorway, because beneath all the pride of invention, the telegraphs, the factories, the light bulbs, something quieter had been lost, the humility of listening to the earth. By the turn of the century, few remembered how it had really felt. The last of the pioneers died, and with them went the stories told by the fire, the ones about nights spent beneath the frost, about how silence could keep you alive. But sometimes on cold nights their children would feel it return, a familiar ache, a restlessness that no amount of comfort could erase. They would open a window to let the winter air in, just for a moment. The chill would touch their faces, and they'd remember. A voice, a rhythm, a feeling of being held by the world instead of fighting it. And every now and then, on Christmas Eve, when the wind swept low and the snow began to fall sideways, someone would look out across the fields and see a shape half buried in white, an old roof maybe, or just the ghost of one, and think, that's where we came from. Not from cities or armies or flags, but from the quiet beneath the storm. And as they turned back toward the warmth of the fire, the wind would press once more against the house, soft and persistent, as if the earth itself were still calling them home. By the early years of the new century, the frontier was no longer a place one could walk to. It had slipped backward into story, into the pages of books printed in cities far from the smell of smoke and damp earth. The men who had once dug homes from frozen ground were now grey and slow, their hands more memory than muscle. When they spoke, people leaned in politely, as if listening to a language half forgotten. Railroads stitched the continent together, and the first cars rattled down muddy streets. There were telephones now, and lights that burned without fire. The country congratulated itself on having conquered distance. Yet for those who remembered the buried winters, all that brightness felt a little too loud, a little too quick, as if the nation had outrun something it still carried in its bones. On winter evenings, when snow blurred the lamps outside, the old ones gathered by stoves and told stories. They did not speak of battles or presidents. They spoke of sound, the way silence used to fall thick enough to touch, the way the ground itself could feel alive. They told the children how, when storms came, people listened to the wind until it told them where to dig. The children laughed. It sounded like myth. But when the wind howled against the house, even the youngest fell quiet for a moment, unsure. Historians began arriving, notebooks in hand, collecting these recollections before they vanished. They wrote about the sod houses, the dugouts, the strange faith of those who had lived inside the earth. Some turned the stories into museum exhibits. Others romanticized them, painting the pioneers as heroes carved from frost and patience. The truth was gentler and more human. They had simply learned how to stay alive in a world that didn't yet care if they did. In 1903, a scholar from St. Louis recorded an elderly woman Sip's Christmas memory. She had been a child during the great blizzard of Sip 66, and her words came out in a whisper. We were underground when the singing came. Not angels, just neighbors, each in their own hole, singing through the wind so we sipped would know we weren't sipped alone. That was our church. Her voice breaks in the transcript there. The historian notes that she smiled afterward, as if embarrassed by the tenderness of it. But that moment, neighbors singing through the snow to remind one another of existence, outlived every monument built above. By 1910, most of the old earth homes had collapsed. Grass covered their mounds. Cattle grazed where kitchens once stood. Travelers passing by saw only the curve of the prairie, and never guessed that beneath their feet lay the remains of rooms filled with breath and candlelight. The silence had reclaimed its shape. And yet, on certain nights, when the wind came down hard from the north and the world went white again, the people in towns and farms still felt it, that pull toward the ground, that memory of warmth below the storm. They would bank their fires, lower their lamps, and listen. For a heartbeat, the age of noise would pause, and somewhere beneath the snow a door would seem to open, just wide enough for a whisper. Rest a while. The earth still remembers. The winter of 1904 came early. The wind rolled down from the Dakotas before the last crops were in, sweeping the plains clean. In the small towns that had replaced the homesteads, people still looked to the sky with the same nervous habit their parents had, searching the clouds not for meaning but for mercy. Inside the houses, now built from wood instead of earth, the cold was different. The new walls groaned at night, brittle and uncertain, as if remembering the soil that used to cradle them. Fires burned hotter, but the warmth felt borrowed. Some families still kept a small cellar, dug deep beneath the kitchen, a remnant of older wisdom. When storms came, they would light a single lamp there, just to see the glow through the floorboards, and remind themselves that safety once came from below. Christmas in those years was quieter than the stories later told of it. There were church bells, yes, but thin and uncertain in the wind. The towns were too young for grandeur, too poor for extravagance. Candles stood in tin holders, wreaths were woven from prairie grass, and children carved toys from corn husks. Yet there was a solemn beauty in it, a kind of reverence born from scarcity. Letters from the time speak of neighbors gathering in barns or schoolhouses, the floors swept clean, a lantern hung high from a rafter. Someone would play a fiddle, its strings slightly out of tune from the cold, and the sound would echo softly against the beams. For a few hours the silence that ruled the plains stepped aside. People laughed, danced, told stories that had grown rounder and softer with each retelling. And when the candles burned low, someone always began to speak about the old winters, the ones their parents had survived underground. The room would still. The children listened with wide eyes as the elders described the storms that erased the horizon, the nights when the earth itself became a blanket. To them it sounded like myth. To the older ones it was still too near to be legend. Outside, snow whispered against the walls. The sound carried through every crack and hinge, a reminder that the season's kindness was thin, conditional. Men checked the barns twice. Women kept the kettles filled with water so they wouldn't freeze solid. There was comfort, but never forgetfulness. In the morning, smoke would rise from chimneys across the town, small grey threads against a sky so pale it seemed already half frozen. The streets would crunch under boots. The air smelled of pine, wood ash, and something faintly metallic. It was a hard world, but not an ungrateful one. The postmasters still brought letters from the east. Christmas greetings printed in gold ink, photographs of city streets draped in lights. People pinned them to the walls and stared a long time, not with envy but with curiosity, as if studying a species of life that had forgotten winter's patience. Because out here, patience was still everything. The train might bring new tools, new goods, new fashions, but the land kept its own tempo. When the snow fell, work stopped. When the drifts rose high, people went inside and waited. And when Christmas came, they did what their parents and grandparents had done. They sang softly into the cold and thanked the ground for holding steady beneath them. One newspaper editor in Nebraska wrote that year, "The East keeps its lights above the streets. Out here we keep ours under the snow." It was meant as poetry, but it was truth. Because beneath every wooden house still lay the ghost of a dugout, and beneath every prayer, the quiet certainty that if the world ever went dark again, the earth would know how to take them back. By the winter of 1906, the country looked the same from a distance. White horizon, low roofs, a sky that seemed to hang by its own weight. Yet something in the rhythm of life had shifted. The trains no longer sounded like visitors. They had become part of the weather, their whistles rolling across the snow the way thunder once did. The people of the plains lived between two tempos. Now, in daylight, they moved with the pulse of the rails. Quick, practical, always listening for the distant rumble that meant the world was still connected to them. But at night, when the lamps were turned low and the frost crept silently up the window glass, the old quiet returned. The land still breathed slow, and those who had been raised on its patience felt it move through them like a second heartbeat. That December, a snowstorm swept through Kansas and Nebraska. A hard one, the kind that erased color and sound for days. Towns vanished under drifts higher than fences. Telegraph poles stood like black bones in the white. Yet no one panicked. The habits of their parents were still alive in them. Men reinforced cellar doors. Women stored food and water below ground. Children were sent to fetch extra blankets, and told, half joking, that the safest place in the world was still under the earth. On Christmas Eve, the wind settled just enough for people to find one another. They gathered where they could, in church basements, in barns, in the narrow rooms of boarding houses built near the tracks. The candles sputtered from draughts that slipped through the walls, but no one minded. Someone poured coffee. Someone tuned a fiddle. Outside, the storm murmured, steady and endless. In a small town near Kearney, a minister read from Luke, his voice thin and measured, and there were shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch by night. A few of the older settlers smiled at that. They knew exactly what it meant to abide, to watch the night, to trust the silence more than the noise. When he finished, an old woman began to sing softly. It came upon the midnight clear. Others joined until the walls seemed to vibrate with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Later they shared what they had: cornbread, beans, a jar of pickled apples someone had saved since autumn. A boy passed around a wooden whistle he had carved himself. Its tune was crooked but hopeful. The storm pressed against the windows, impatient but never cruel, and for a few hours the world felt perfectly balanced between fear and peace. The next morning dawned without color. Snow lay in waves across the prairie, smooth and unbroken. Smoke rose straight upward from chimneys, pale and slow. Families dug paths to their barns, laughing quietly at the labor. They knew the thaw would come, as it always did, and they also knew the land would keep every footprint until spring. Letters from that winter speak of gratitude, without triumph. One farmer wrote, "The storm stayed 3 days. We stayed 4. Another, younger man added, "I think my father was right. The ground listens." Each generation found its own way of saying the same thing, that survival was not progress, not conquest. It was conversation, a long, unending dialogue between breath and wind, between the warmth of a single room and the infinite patience of snow. And so the winters went on, year after year, each one a little louder above the ground, each one still whispering below it. By the time another decade turned, The dugouts had all but disappeared. Grass covered them completely, their roofs collapsing softly into the soil until nothing remained but a faint hollow in the earth, and sometimes a single stone where a hearth once stood. The prairie had reclaimed its memory, and the world above carried on. But every winter, when the first true snow arrived, the wind still seemed to remember. It moved lower, slower, curling along the frozen ground as if searching for the doors that were no longer there. It was easy to believe that somewhere under the drifts those old rooms still waited, quiet, warm, and patient. The people who had lived through those years grew old in wooden houses, then in towns with lights bright enough to wash the stars from the sky. They raised children who would never know what it meant to dig for safety, or to measure time by the weight of silence. Yet even those children felt it sometimes, on nights when the wind pressed hard against the glass, or when the fire burned low and the house seemed to breathe. Then, without knowing why, they would lower their voices. They would speak softly, as if someone beneath the floorboards might still be listening. At Christmas, the families who had once hidden underground now gathered in churches of brick and glass. But the words they spoke were the same words whispered generations before, about faith, endurance, mercy, and the strange grace of the land itself. The hymns rose into rafters instead of tunnels, but they carried the same quiet gratitude. Every verse was a remembrance. And when the service ended, they stepped outside into the night. The snow would fall in slow, deliberate flakes, the air sharp and clean. For a moment, all the noise of the new century faded. The trains, the laughter, the music, and what remained was the same sound their ancestors once heard in the stillness between storms, the heartbeat of the land. They stood there, faces turned upward, feeling the weight of the cold and the warmth of the memory that lived beneath it. Because the story of the frontier was never truly about conquest, or progress, or even survival. It was about belonging. About a people who learned, through suffering and silence, that the earth was not their enemy but their keeper. And though the dugouts have vanished and the wind now sings to no one in particular, some part of that lesson endures, passed quietly from voice to voice, a wisdom spoken only when the fire burns low and the snow begins to fall sideways. It says the ground remembers, the storm passes, and beneath it all, life waits, patient as the earth itself.